March 1943, Tunisia. For 6 days, American intelligence had been facing the same problem. A stubborn German prisoner who understood exactly how little he had to give them. He did not argue, he did not lose his temper. He did not try to outsmart every question. He simply gave the 3 things required of him: his name, his rank, his serial number, then silence. He was a Luftwaffe officer, captured after his aircraft came down beyond the forward American lines, and every man who questioned him walked out of the room with the same empty result. No routes, no fuel stops, no landing strips. No hint of where German aircraft were disappearing into the desert before striking American supply lines again. Somewhere beyond the map, the Luftwaffe had a hidden refueling base, not large enough to draw attention from the sky, but useful enough to extend the reach of German aircraft across the Tunisian front. The prisoner knew where it was, and he knew silence was the safest way to protect it. Then the file reached George Patton. Patton did not ask how loudly the prisoner had been questioned. He did not ask whether the man had been threatened, pressured, or pushed harder than before. He asked for the crash report, the fuel estimate, the last known heading, and the map. That was where he saw it. If the prisoner's aircraft had truly been flying from the base the Americans already knew, then when it was damaged, it should have turned toward safety. But it had turned the other way. A trained pilot does not turn away from safety unless he knows another place exists. When Patton finally entered the interrogation room, he carried no speech, only a folded map, and one question sharp enough to make silence dangerous. Hauptmann Karl Weiss was not the kind of prisoner who looked defeated just because he was behind a guarded door. He was 38 years old, a Luftwaffe officer with enough desert flying behind him to understand that survival in North Africa often depended on discipline more than courage. Heat, dust, engine failure, bad navigation, bad luck. All of it could kill a pilot before the enemy ever touched him. So when his damaged aircraft came down near the American forward area and patrolmen pulled him out of the wreckage alive, Weiss treated captivity as another kind of weather. Unpleasant, dangerous, but manageable if a man did not panic. That was why the first interrogators found him so difficult. He was polite enough to avoid giving them a reason to call him disorderly, calm enough to avoid looking afraid, and experienced enough to understand exactly where the line was. Each time they asked about his unit, his route, his fuel stop, or the field he had last used, he returned to the same narrow answer: name, rank, serial number, nothing more. To a young intelligence officer, that kind of silence could feel like failure. But to Weiss, it was a form of duty. He did not need to defeat the Americans in conversation. He only needed to deny them one useful piece of information long enough for the Luftwaffe to keep using what the Americans had not yet found. Somewhere beyond the known airfields, there was a place that mattered. Not a grand airbase with hangars, barracks, and obvious tracks visible from every reconnaissance photograph. Something smaller, a rough strip cut into the desert logic of wadis, fuel drums, camouflage netting, and men who knew how to make an aircraft vanish just long enough to be useful. A forward refueling point like that could change the range of everything. It could let German aircraft appear where Allied planners thought they should not be able to appear. It could turn a safe convoy route into a guessing game. It could make an American supply column wonder whether the sky above it had been misread. Weiss knew that. The men questioning him knew only that something was missing. So he sat in the chair, answered what the law required, and let the Americans waste their questions against a wall he had built 6 days earlier. By the 6th day, he believed he understood the room. He understood the questions. He understood the rhythm. What he did not yet understand was that George Patton was not coming in to ask the same questions louder. When Major Edward Larkin brought the file to Patton, he expected the usual questions about the prisoner. Had Weiss been cooperative? No. Had he contradicted himself? Not directly. Had he shown fear, fatigue, anger, pride, anything useful? Only discipline. Larkin had already spent hours with the man, and the result was the same clean wall every time. Name, rank, serial number, then silence. In another headquarters, that might have been the end of it until a translator, a specialist, or another round of questioning could be arranged. But Patton was less interested in the silence than in the space around it. He asked for the map, then the crash report, then the fuel estimate. Captain Samuel Briggs spread the papers across a field table while Patton stood over them without speaking. There was a penciled circle where Weiss's aircraft had come down. There was a line marking the heading reported by the patrol that had seen the aircraft losing altitude. There was another notation from the mechanics, who examined the wreckage and estimated how much fuel remained in the tanks when it hit the ground. Individually, none of those details looked decisive. Together, they began to argue. The known German field at Gabes sat in one direction. If Weiss had been trying to save his aircraft and return to the safest known landing ground, his damaged plane should have turned that way. A pilot with engine trouble does not normally make the desert larger for himself. He does not choose distance when survival depends on reducing it. But Weiss had not turned toward Gabes. He had turned away from it. That was the first crack. Briggs suggested wind. Patton shook his head. The correction was too clean for wind. Larkin suggested confusion during descent. Patton looked at the line again and said, "A trained Luftwaffe officer did not survive years of war by mistaking the direction of his own base when the engine began to fail." Then Patton noticed the second detail. The fuel estimate was wrong for the story the map was supposed to tell. There was too much left if Weiss had come directly from the known field, and too little if he had been flying a longer patrol without support. The numbers sat in the middle, uncomfortable and unfinished, as if the aircraft had touched some hidden point between what the Americans knew and what the prisoner refused to say. Patton leaned closer to the map. A blank area west of the marked route lay near a dry wadi, empty on paper, useless at first glance. But empty places on maps had killed men before. Patton tapped the blank space once. Not hard, just enough for both officers to look. "There," he said, and for the first time, the prisoner's silence had a location. When Patton finally entered the interrogation room, Hauptmann Karl Weiss was ready for the wrong man. He had heard the name, of course. Every German officer in North Africa had heard something about Patton by then, especially after the Americans began stiffening their lines and moving with a different kind of discipline. Weiss expected noise. He expected theater. He expected the famous American general to arrive with polished boots, hard eyes, and a voice loud enough to turn the room into a battlefield. That expectation helped him feel prepared. A man can defend himself against shouting if he has already decided not to answer. He can survive insults by retreating into rank, law, and silence. He can let anger pass over him and still give only the three things required: name, rank, serial number. But Patton did not give him the performance he was ready to resist. He came in with Major Larkin behind him and a folded map under one arm. He did not slam it on the table. He did not begin with accusations. He did not ask Weiss where the hidden field was, because that was the question every prisoner expects, and every trained officer prepares himself not to answer. Patton sat down slowly, opened the map, and turned it so both men could see it. For a moment, no one spoke. That silence did more damage than a threat would have done, because it gave Weiss time to look at the paper and realize the Americans were no longer searching blindly. There was a penciled circle at the crash site. There was a route line drawn across the desert. There was a mark near Gabes, the known field, and another mark farther west, placed in an empty stretch near a dry wadi that should not have mattered to anyone. But it mattered to Patton. Weiss saw that immediately. The general was not studying his face the way the previous interrogators had. He was not waiting for fear, pride, fatigue, or anger to betray him. Patton was studying the map as if the prisoner were only one piece of evidence among several, and that changed the balance in the room. Weiss could remain silent against questions, but silence was harder when the question had not yet been asked, and the map was already accusing him. Patton let the moment stretch just long enough for Weiss to understand the danger. Then he looked up and asked only one thing. Patton did not ask the question the prisoner was prepared to refuse. He did not ask where the hidden base was. He did not ask who commanded it, how many aircraft used it, or how often German pilots refueled there before striking American supply lines. Those were obvious questions, and obvious questions give a trained prisoner a place to hide. Instead, Patton placed one finger on the known German field near Gabes, then moved it along the line of Weiss's reported flight path. His hand stopped at the penciled circle where the damaged aircraft had come down. After that, he moved his finger west, toward the dry Wadi that did not appear in any official Allied airfield report. Weiss watched him do it. That was the first mistake. A man guarding a secret can control his mouth, but controlling his eyes is harder when someone touches the edge of what he is trying to protect. Patton did not look up immediately. He let the map do the work first. Then, in a voice low enough that Weiss had to listen carefully, he asked, "Captain, if Gabes was your base, why did you turn your damaged aircraft away from Gabes and toward Wadi el-Khir?" The room held still. Major Larkin, standing near the wall, did not move. The guard at the door kept his eyes forward. Weiss sat with both hands on the table, and for the first time since his capture, the silence around him did not feel like control. It felt like a decision closing in. If he denied the name Wadi el-Khir too quickly, he would give it weight. If he answered nothing, Patton still had enough to send the point to reconnaissance. If he explained the turn, he risked explaining the very place he had spent 6 days protecting. So Weiss chose the smallest correction. "It was not a base," he said. Patton looked up, not surprised, not triumphant, only attentive. Because that was not a denial, it was a distinction. A prisoner who had spent 6 days giving only name, rank, and serial number had suddenly decided one word in Patton's question was too dangerous to leave untouched. Base. That was the word Weiss could not accept, and by correcting it, he gave Patton the truth in the shape of a technicality. Not a base, something smaller, a strip, a place to land, a place to refuel, a place useful enough for the Luftwaffe to hide, and dangerous enough for Weiss to protect. Patton folded the map halfway, as if the session had already given him what he came for. Then he said, almost quietly, "That will do." Patton did not ask Weiss to explain what he meant. That restraint was what made the moment work. A less careful interrogator might have leaned forward the second he heard the correction. Not a base? Then what was it? Who used it? How many aircraft? How often? Where were the fuel drums? Which unit guarded it? The room could have filled quickly with questions, and every new question would have given Weiss time to realize how much he had just given away. Patton did not make that mistake. He had not entered the room to collect a confession. He had entered to test a contradiction, and the contradiction had answered. A man who had refused to say more than name, rank, and serial number for 6 days had suddenly corrected one word, because that word threatened the secret more than silence did. Base. Weiss could not leave it there, so he changed it, and in doing so, he told Patton what the empty place on the map really was. Something smaller than a base, something rougher, easier to hide, and harder for aerial reconnaissance to identify if no one knew exactly where to look. A forward strip, a refueling point, a patch of desert where aircraft could touch down just long enough to take on fuel, receive direction, and return to the war from an angle Allied planners had not expected. Outside the interrogation room, Patton reopened the map on the field table. Major Larkin stood beside him, still processing the fact that the prisoner had not technically confessed to anything. Captain Briggs traced the flight line again, this time with Wadi el-Khir treated not as empty ground, but as a possible center of movement. The fuel estimate looked different now. The turn away from Gabes looked different. Even the crash site no longer seemed like the end of a flight. It looked like the final mistake in a hidden route. Patton marked the dry Wadi with a pencil. He did not press hard. He did not need to. The mark was small, but it changed the map around it. Supply roads, convoy routes, suspected enemy patrol arcs, and previous air attacks began to make a colder kind of sense. What had seemed random now had a source. What had seemed like reach now had a reason. Patton looked at the point for another moment, then gave the order in the same flat tone he had used in the room. Send it to air. That was all. No speech, no celebration, no attempt to make the prisoner's mistake bigger than it was. For Patton, intelligence was not victory by itself. It was only useful when it moved. And now, one dot on the map was ready to move men into the sky. By the time the mark left Patton's pencil, Weiss was no longer the center of the problem. That was another thing the prisoner had failed to understand. He believed the secret lived inside his own silence. As long as he did not give the Americans a name, a coordinate, a runway length, or a unit designation, he believed the hidden strip remained protected. In a narrow sense, he was right. He had not given a confession. He had not drawn a map for them. He had not announced where German aircraft were touching down between missions. But war rarely hides its secrets in only one place. A pilot can refuse to speak, but his aircraft still falls somewhere. Fuel still burns at a measurable rate. A damaged engine still forces a decision. A trained man still turns toward what he believes can save him. And when that turn does not match the official map, the silence around it begins to lose its strength. That was what Patton understood. He did not treat the battlefield as a flat drawing. He treated it as a chain of choices. Someone chose where to place fuel. Someone chose which route German aircraft could use. Someone chose which empty ground was worth defending by secrecy. And finally, when the engine failed, Weiss chose which direction gave him the best chance to survive. That choice had spoken before the prisoner ever entered the room. Patton's question only forced Weiss to hear it. Major Larkin saw the lesson more clearly afterward than he had inside the room. For 6 days, American intelligence had been trying to make Weiss give them the missing piece. Patton had done something colder. He showed Weiss that the missing piece already had an outline, and that the prisoner was now only being asked to confirm the shape. That is why the correction mattered. It was not a base. A frightened man might have denied everything. A careless man might have answered too much. But Weiss was neither. He was disciplined, precise, and trained to protect operational facts. That was exactly why the correction betrayed him. He could not stand to let the Americans misunderstand the secret in a way that might lead them to the right place for the wrong reason. So he sharpened their word, and sharpened their target with it. In intelligence work, that is sometimes enough, not a confession, not a breakdown, not a dramatic admission spoken under pressure. Just one correction from a man who had stayed silent too long to waste words by accident. Patton had asked one question, but the answer had begun miles away, in the desert, when a damaged German aircraft turned toward a place the map said did not exist. Within days, the blank space near Wadi el-Khir was no longer blank. Reconnaissance pilots went looking with better instructions than they had before. They were not searching the whole desert now. They were searching a contradiction. A damaged aircraft had turned away from its known base. A fuel estimate had refused to match the official route. A prisoner who had said almost nothing for 6 days had suddenly corrected one word when Patton named the place. That was enough to narrow the sky. What the pilots found was not a grand Luftwaffe airbase built for photographs and maps. It was smaller, rougher, and easier to miss from above unless a man already knew where to look. Tracks half covered by blown sand. Fuel drums broken into separate clusters. Camouflage netting arranged to look like nothing from altitude. A strip of ground flat enough for aircraft that did not intend to stay long. The Germans had hidden it well, but they had not hidden the logic that led to it. That was the part Patton understood better than Weiss had expected. The prisoner believed silence could protect a place. Patton believed places protected by silence still had to obey distance, fuel, direction, and fear. If aircraft were appearing where they should not appear, then something was feeding them. If a damaged pilot turned away from the safest known field, then he was not turning into emptiness. He was turning toward hope. The hidden strip was struck soon after. No grand announcement followed. No newspaper headline explained the question in the interrogation room. No one wrote that a German officer had given away a refueling point by trying not to give away a base. In war, some victories do not arrive with flags. They arrive as a red mark crossed off a map, a convoy route that becomes safer, and a pattern of enemy aircraft that stops making sense for the other side. As for Weiss, he had never given Patton the answer directly. He had not said, "Here is the base." He had not pointed to the map. He had only said, "It was not a base." But that was the mistake, because Patton had not needed him to confess. He had needed him to care about the difference. A base could be denied. A refueling strip could be hidden, but a correction made too quickly could betray both. That was why the question worked. Patton did not break the German with threats. He broke the lie with one question. And by the time the prisoner understood that, the map had already started talking louder than he ever intended to.